What if the American church were actually dying and we were totally unaware of it because we love it exactly the way it is? What I mean by that is that right now, 3 out of 4 churches across the United States are currently dying. In fact, over the last 25 to 30 years, we've seen over 40 million people who have left the church and left their faith, which is more combined than all of the people who gave their lives to Jesus during the Great Awakening, during the revival with Billy Graham historically. Now, there are churches of all different shapes and sizes and flavors. We have traditional churches and liturgical churches and mega churches and high production, all of those combined. And there are isolated pockets of growth, but the concerning trend that we're seeing is that oftentimes this growth is misleading. And when we get into the data, there's a different story to be told. So let me take you a little bit further into my story and why this topic became a great concern to me. See, back in 2019, I was a pastor at a church, and our goal was church growth. And I think it was for the right reasons. I mean, if your church is growing, people are being led to Jesus. You're discipling people. Like, it made a lot of sense at the time. And so we copied everything we could from growing churches, models that were working really well, thriving church plant conferences. I mean, we took everything we could and we implemented it, and it worked. I mean, we saw our church top of page 1 on Google. People would see us everywhere online, and they were sure they were supposed to come visit our church the following Sunday. It was just a really fun, exciting time. It was super validating. And I think at that moment, I was loving this church growth phase of life. And it was really cool. I mean, people were jumping into small groups. People were getting connected. I mean, all the stories. And yes, people were even getting saved and being baptized. And it wasn't until 2020, COVID happened, and churches all of a sudden were at risk of closing forever, couldn't pay their bills, couldn't pay their staff. People weren't sure what they even thought of church anymore. And, people had to realize again that church is not Sunday morning. We are the church. And really this hardship shouldn't be something that should be able to stop the church anyway. But in that moment, I think it was, seeing our church grow like wild, despite so many churches beginning to shut down. It was really eye-opening. And while we were doing our Next Steps classes, we'd have new people every single month. I mean, our problem was not getting new people. Our problem was actually helping new people stay and be retained and getting them integrated and helping them go from new to known. And in these Next Steps classes, as we would get to know people, we would begin asking them hey, how did you hear about us? And also, where are you from? Tell us your story. The pattern that I began to see emerge was we were not seeing people who were far from God, unchurched, who had given their lives to Jesus as a result of someone sharing the gospel, or someone who'd been discipled by someone in our church who's now getting further connected. It was almost always church people who found our church and were looking for something new. And I think in that moment, really, it was God woke me up. And I realized we were celebrating growth, and it was so much fun and exciting. And yet that growth was very misleading. It was misleading because it was all based on transference. And that's when it hit me that have we replaced the mission of the church for attending and for church growth, but are we really doing well at being disciples who make disciples and reaching people around us? And that question then led me further into looking at the research, looking at the data, looking at the trends, and seeing what really is the state of the church. And here's what I found. Every year, about 4,000 churches are planted in the United States, and then every year, about 3,700 churches close. However, even more recent studies are showing that we're actually closing more churches than we are planting, numbers ranging from anywhere to 5,000 to 10,000 churches closing per year. And this was a huge concern. Another study by the greatopportunity.org found that they're expecting that yearly church closure rate to go to 5,500 churches per year over the next 30 years. And in total, they're expecting 176,000 churches that are going to close between now and 2050. Looking into some different sectors where they're seeing impact, they ran a scenario. And this was the base case, so neither the worst nor the best, that they expect to see by 2050 if we don't make changes in what we're doing as the church. 35 million. That is the number of youth raised in Christian homes who will disaffiliate from Christianity, which is over 1 million per year. 73% to 59%. The overall Christian percentage of the population will drop to 59% from today's 73%. And then 50 million, that's the unaffiliated population. It's expected to nearly double as a percentage of the US population, from 17% today to 30% in 2050, which is an increase of more than 50 million people. Again, saying all of that, we're looking at the base case, which is neither the worst or the best case scenario. In 2023, Barna found that 1% of pastors said their church was effective at reaching unchurched people. And in 2015, it was at 13%. So between 2015 to 2023, we went from 13% of pastors feeling like their church could reach unchurched people around them. Now in 2023, only 1% of all pastors who feel like their church is capable of reaching lost and unchurched people around them. When we look at church growth across the United States, only 3 to 5% of American churches that are growing, which is only 25% of all American churches, are actually growing through conversion growth. That means that the majority of the growing churches around us and that we're in are only growing as a result of church transference, which again is a misleading metric when we think about growth overall. From 2020 to 2023, the number of Gen Z who never go to church grew from 28% to 37%. And here's another big statistic which is just wild to think about. The Southern Baptist, they recently issued out a report sharing their statistics, and they showed that a full 77% of all their churches baptized between 0 and 5 people in a full calendar year. And if you know anything about church growth and church attendance, you're probably thinking that those people who were baptized in that church might simply just be the people's kids who are already in the church. The concern again is we're not doing well at actually reaching people far from God. So then the big question is, why are we seeing so many churches close? Why are we seeing closures begin to outpace church plants? And why are we seeing so many people leave the church and their faith altogether? And what if these are actually symptoms, not the root issue? What if the root issue is something way more within and core to the church? What if it is not an issue of church planting and models, but it's an issue of discipleship, an issue of the mission? Perhaps we've exchanged the mission of the church for church. We've made it all about church attendance, church on Sunday mornings, church growth at all costs, instead of the mission to go and make disciples. Think about it this way. It's been said that if you plant a church, you rarely get disciples, but if you make disciples, you always get a church. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer once said, Christianity without discipleship is Christianity without Christ. So then what would we look at to see if discipleship is actually the core thing that is missing, and as a result, we're seeing these signs and symptoms? Well, here's some studies that were found by discipleship.org and Barna. Fewer than 5% of U.S. churches have a reproducing disciple-making culture. No U.S. churches were found to show characteristics of viral-like disciple-making movements. And only 17% of the entire church in the United States knows what the Great Commission is and what it means. So when we take that into consideration, it only makes sense that discipleship is actually the thing that has been void and not present within so many churches, and why we're seeing the negative results and impacts in churches across the United States. So when we look at what is going on with discipleship in churches across the United States, it makes sense that we've actually found the root issue. Discipleship is not present. And yet, what we're seeing is that discipleship is becoming a buzzword across churches. Churches know that the American church is lacking in discipleship and it's being brought into communication and announcements. But what we're still doing as the American church is we're leaving out the hard ask, the hard, high challenge, high grace invitation that everyone is called to be disciples who make disciples. Instead, we're seeing still more consumer Christianity perpetuated when we simply just invite people into an optional evening program, leaving them in knowledge acquisition loops that still just bring them back to Sunday morning services and simply invite them to attend. We have to do a better job as the church in the United States in creating a disciple-making lifestyle and culture within our churches. We have to help people shift from being church goers into disciple makers. We need to introduce people to Jesus in a deep relationship with him and how to follow him, becoming self-sustaining disciples who know they're called to make disciples and what their mission is. All right, so if you care about this urgent void and crisis in discipleship, then I want to invite you to do a few things. First is go to ordinarymovement.com, go through our training, learn how to bring discipling culture, learn how to create a disciple-making movement in and through your local church, through people like you and I, through ordinary believers, people who maybe you're a new believer, maybe you've been in church your entire life, maybe you've never been discipled. Listen, we've created a training to walk you through every question you'd have about leading your own groups so that you can disciple people. And our discipleship process is something that you walk through and you learn how to be a disciple as you're discipling other people. Meaning you don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to have a title. You don't need to have a certificate. You don't even need to have been following Jesus for years to do it. You just have to be willing to say yes. And our discipleship process is super simple. We've taken the guesswork out of it. We provide a ton of resources. We also provide coaching and mentoring for every step of the way. It is simple. It is highly reproducible. It is scalable. And as a result, through ordinary people like you and I, when you just say yes and you start off a group and you begin investing in people, we see the people that we survey that go through our groups, over 90% of all of them see greater intimacy with Jesus, meaning their relationship with Jesus went deeper and they learned to hear his voice and seek him more. And as a result, we see multiplication. We're seeing groups multiply into many groups, and those many groups multiplying into subsequent generations, to the third and fourth generations. And listen, all it takes is a person like you saying yes. So check out ordinarymovement.com, begin our training, launch your groups. We'll be with you every step of the way. And if you want to learn more about the state of discipleship and the state of the church, I had a lot of questions after doing the research, and I began to interview pastors. And so you can check those out right here. I talked to pastors who are church planners, veteran pastors who've been doing it for over 30 years, from all different backgrounds, from the Southern Baptist to the Assemblies of God and non-denom churches. And I just picked their brains, asking them what is going on and how do we improve discipleship back into our churches. So check those out, and I'll see you on the interviews or at ordinarymovement.com.